Good day and welcome to SCO BRICS Insight, where we look at what's really going on in the world of the BRICS. Now, my name is Rod Mackenzie, and today I want to talk about the EU, the USA and Russia. Now, it's obvious to anybody observing that the only unifying factor that the European Union has today is the complete absence of any shared vision for the future. I mean, in the USA, you have MAGA, Make America Great Again. In Russia, it's import substitution and self-sufficiency. China has the One Belt, One Road project. India has its 21st century modernization plan. And virtually all countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America have adopted their own vision of what they see the future is. However, the Europeans and their politicians' ideas about an ideal tomorrow are their desire to prolong yesterday. It's almost like the Beatles song, I Believe in Yesterday, and that's the way their focus is. I mean, there's a key difference between the Europeans and other populations. It's a strong sense of optimism regarding the future, with a focus on achieving ideal visions and versions of what they see as the future. Europe, in contrast, has a preference for a more traditional, nostalgic approach, focusing on the past. I mean, this feature transforms Europe into a terrain of like-minded people where the inhabitants unanimously despise those around them and constantly argue with each other. I mean, the collective interest that the European integration theories had hoped for has indeed emerged, but the scope of action has been found to be very limited and can be reduced to the desire to take advantage of the weakness of others. I mean, in terms of achieving global impact, each European nation is essentially operating in isolation, as in every man or woman for themselves. I mean, Germany is attempting to defend its position as the centre of the European economy by consistently communicating to the Americans that it's the only reliable business partner in Europe. I mean, France's emphasis is on its military superiority, but its military capabilities in and of themselves are not actually considered to be of that great significance, and particularly now that they've been kicked out of most of their former colonies in sub-Saharan Africa. However, when viewed in comparison to those of Germany, Spain and Italy, their military actually seems to be in relatively good shape. I mean, Britain, on the other hand, having recently rediscovered its role on the European stage, has attempted to use this opportunity to its advantages by leveraging the impending changes and hoping for a confrontation with Russia. Although most people know that the British are all talk and their armed forces are a bit of a joke, so they're just doing something to make loud noises, etc. I mean, Poland seeks to maintain a neutral stance in the Franco-British strategic manoeuvres and attempts to emphasise its unique relationship with Washington, though the reasons for this do remain unclear. Now, before I continue, I'd like to make an appeal. If you like and enjoy my videos, you can help me fund the channel and my website, SCOBRICSinsight.com, to further develop it. You can do this by making a small donation, which can be done by clicking on the thanks button at the bottom of the video screen. Everybody who does donate gets a personal thank you from me, and I'm thanking you all now for watching because I do really greatly appreciate all your comments and all your thanks, etc. So do keep the comments coming because I do love to read and respond to them. Now, Italy's already become quite accustomed to building external relations without any regard to its European allies. I mean, the pragmatic right-wingers in power in Italy are ready for dialogue with both the US and with Russia. Some of the smaller European predators and herbivores are doing their best just to survive, but the likelihood of their survival is diminishing. The entire situation can be likened to the concept of Europe in international politics. I mean, the situation is further exacerbated by the ill-considered statements of the Brussels bureaucracy leaders who lack the necessary influence and were all put into positions mainly to provide scapegoats for the European government's make-up's own missteps. I mean, European politics has evolved into a stage performance both in its form and its content, and is characterised by a lack of authentic emotions and passions, with the roles being memorised and performed by actors with varying degrees of talent, and most of them without very much. Now, it's important to acknowledge that European politics has always been a theatre. However, but it should be recognised in the presence of real power among the leading powers until the mid-20th century made even false emotions threatening. We all remember Mr. Schicklgruber, of course. Now, it's become increasingly evident that not only words and feelings are now considered false, but the whole power of the European states is being undermined. I mean, this downward trend began a considerable time ago, but it was the significant changes, particularly over the last 15 years, that have dealt Europe blows from which it's never been able to recover. I mean, following the conclusion of the Cold War, there was a notable increase in the level of animosity among Europeans. I mean, particularly with those were on one side of the Iron Curtain and those that were on this side of it. There was a considerable discussion of common foreign and defence policy and a significant move towards a single currency that they said would be stronger than the dollar and provide Europe with a prosperous future. In other words, it was going to be, according to Borrell, the Garden of Eden that would flourish and promising to all those around it a profitable and less troublesome time in the future. However, the debate on independence from NATO was swiftly and decisively addressed by the Americans and their British allies, or lapdogs as I like to call them. The latter was always viewed its involvement in the EU as a measure to cause discord amongst the continental Europeans, and the final point was the readmission of France into NATO's military structures back in 2007. I mean, the pivotal moment prior to that came with the opposition mounted by Paris and Berlin against American plans to invade Iraq in 2003, which obviously Tony Blair went all in with. So it became evident that the EU's endeavours to establish itself as part of a major unipolar world had not been successful. Consequently, it was imperative to adopt a more assertive approach by the time the European autonomy had passed. Now, the history of the single currency has resulted in a mostly small and even medium-sized European states becoming economically dependent on Germany. I mean, the euro became just a German mark in another name, and that was the reason it was hated. And Germany was hated by people who are inherently weak and who can only hate like somebody who is strong. And the Germans quickly became accustomed to operating without formal protocols with their junior partners within the European Union. Financial decisions during the debt crisis of 2009 to 2011, particularly over Greece and the pandemic, demonstrated the dominance of German power, and all the political possibilities of the community were used by them. In 2022, when the crisis in relations between Moscow and the West entered the military technical phase, Europeans welcomed the severance of Russian-German ties. They understood that the German economy would suffer severely, and this would lead to a shift in German attitudes. Indeed, France, which has provided the least financial support to the Kiev regime, is currently held in higher esteem than Germany is, despite the latter's substantial donations. In September 2022, the Russophobic Polish foreign minister welcomed the destruction of Nord Stream. That's that Sikorsky guy. He's married to the neocon Anne Applebaum. And he expressed concern not about the impact it would have on Russia, but the damage to the German economy was what he was celebrating. He was happy with that. So gradually the Europeans began to question their symbolic geopolitical revival after the collapse of the USSR and the expansion of the European Union to the east. Now, for over 2 decades, European foreign policy has been focused on the ability to take over and develop the territories that were previously controlled by Russia or the Soviet Union as part of the Warsaw Pact. In order to achieve this goal, the leading European states chose to break off relations with Moscow, but didn't receive very much to strengthen their positions in their dialogue with the United States. However, the new EU members did not become passive executors of the will of Berlin or Paris, but began to understand that the US's dominant role in the region, and they realized that they were the significant influence. Now, following a series of failed initiatives, the European Union came to the conclusion that the most beneficial course of action for them was to maintain the status quo, preserve their established way of life and their associated ideals. Consequently, Europe lost sight of its former ambitions, and life and foreign policy are meaningless without that. Furthermore, the gradual deterioration in its own juices creates an extraordinarily unpleasant atmosphere within the EU. And that has continued. Now, following the UK's exit from the European Union, Brexit, which was finalised as Brexit in name only in January 2020, the escalating geopolitical tensions have led to renewed engagement in regional political affairs. Now, the prevailing economic challenges within the UK, coupled with the elite's inability to effectively address these major issues, and that's illustrated by the frequent leadership change in London over the past 3 years. There's 5 prime ministers in 3 years. That's quite a lot. Are prompting the British to adopt a confrontational stance toward Russia as a means of attempting to maintain their global relevance and influence. But that's not seeming to work. Everybody takes it seriously. So this ongoing conflict necessitates the constant deployment of potentially new military resources. And since the British themselves are reluctant to do this, it's London that's encouraging its continental neighbours to perceive that Russia is a major threat and will be invading soon. Now, this is obviously in line with Britain's foreign policy tradition, but it's now encouraging Germany, for which it has no apologies, to get up against and confront Russia. Now, in the best interest of the German people, that they actually reach an agreement with Russia and going back to the trade levels that went before. However, they're unable to proceed because of the significant American presence on Germany and the demands of their own military lobbyists who basically make a lot of money out of it. That said, Germany still hopes to maintain a passive resolve and retain the majority of the funds that is allocated for defence within the country and not spend it all in America. Now, this is particularly relevant given the gradual decline of the South European countries as reliable sources of maintaining German well-being. They can't sell them much anymore because that's all gone. So Berlin is currently welcoming any Franco-British improvisations that could drive the current crisis in the relationship between the countries and Russia into deeper waters. However, the French do not require significant assistance in this regard. President Mini Napoleon Macron's confidence in his own superiority is such that he's willing to engage personally in any diplomatic crisis and just make it worse. I mean, the only factor that mitigates this concern is the discrepancy between his politicians' words and his actions. I mean, he's been talking about troops into the Ukraine for months and nothing's happened. Now, in terms of the internal European context, it's clear that France's primary objective is to ensure that Britain acquiesces to the French nuclear umbrella, gives up its own and becomes basically subservient to France. Meanwhile, Germany, which become accustomed to the dominant role in European affairs over the last 30 years, has experienced its significant economic challenges as its economic engine has basically broken down. I mean, a key indicator of the current state of affairs within the European state community was provided by the visits to Washington in the first few months of 2025 after Donald Trump was elected and took office. All the prominent figures of the old world made pilgrimage to the American capital, with the exception of the Germans, who are still deliberating the formation of a government following their elections in February. Their coalition's still not been finalised. So it was evident the primary objective of the visits to Trump by Sir Wang Keir, the British Prime Minister, Mini Macron and Napoleon and the Polish President were to request favourable treatment for their respective states. Now, in the context of the American strategy of divide and rule, it's important to consider whether such advantages can be achieved at the expense of the other Europeans. Of course it will. So in contrast to the previously prevailing sentiment, Hungary and Slovakia historically adopted a rebellious stance towards the larger Western neighbours like Germany and France, and the sustained influence of Berlin and Paris on minority countries' rights and their liberal agenda has been a long-standing concern. Now, Spain and Italy have made it clear that Russia doesn't impose an immediate threat to them and they are not interested in getting involved. If France and Britain wish to pursue a course of action, they are liberty to do so, but Italy and Spain will not be providing any material support to them. Now, the head of the Italian government, Giorgia Meloni, has made it clear that dialogue with the Americans is exclusively bilateral in nature and doesn't take into account the interests of the rest of Europe or any of the other countries. I mean, the main states of this association have delegated to the care of the interests of the European Union as a whole to Brussels and its bureaucracy. But obviously, it's evident that in the manifestations that they are simultaneously doing are illogical, irresponsible and unconventional. But it is every man for himself. I mean, whilst it does adhere to the specific ethical framework when engaging with EU member states, of course, a few weeks ago, for example, the new head of the European foreign policy, the mad, crazy and Russophobic Estonian Kaja Kallas, whose father actually was a member of the Soviet Communist Party, was subjected to general vilification due to her degree of provincialism. She seems to have taken her position a bit over seriously and publicly called for all EU countries to allocate tens of billions of euros to support the regime in Kiev. Now, this resulted in her encroachment upon the domain of financial decisions and obligation, of which the EU countries are not willing to relinquish their autonomy and follow the directives of the EU supranational entities. Now, the head of the European Commission, the President of the European Council, who hold the higher status, did not condone her actions. So Ursula von der Leyen is aware that even if one is as corrupt as she has, problems will not arise unless she starts to impose and investigate the finances of in the European capitals of Brussels, Paris, Berlin, etc. I mean, Europe's a geopolitical entity that operates exclusively within its own internal sphere. I mean, the primary responsibility of European politicians is to ensure that they maintain a position of influence, facilitating constructive dialogue between Washington, Moscow and Beijing. And that's really the limit of it. I mean, the duration of Europe's current state of affairs is contingent particularly on the actions of what the US wants. It shouts jump and the EU has to say how high. Only the US has the capacity to reinvigorate the order within its satellite states of the year and give them a sense of purpose. So Russia has every reason to expect comparative stability in Europe as an obligation that creates the rights of the US to tell them what to do and fully control the strategic destiny of what's happening in places that in former times determined the destinies of all mankind. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. Set the alert button so you get to see when I'm posting a new video, and click on the thanks button at the bottom of the screen if you want to make a donation. Thank you.